We're reading from Matthew chapter 2. After the wise men were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother." The angel said, "Stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." That night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet, "I called my son out of Egypt."
Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are dead.
Nervous there in the lighting. There's these decorative plumes that look highly flammable. So I was getting ready to take off my jacket and throw it over there just in case. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Good morning. And we're so glad that you're here. Thanks for being with us on this Sunday before Christmas. A special thanks to the folks in the balcony. I don't know. It's just fun. It's just fun. One of the things you might have noticed, the Christmas story is so oft said, and the Christmas story is so oft repeated, that if we're not careful, I think we can hallmark or precious moment-ize it. You know what I'm talking about? Like this is, aww, look at the baby sheep, look how cute! Look how cute! I mean, these are adorable, right? The problem with that, of course, is that kind of idea of and the Gospels give it to us, right? Luke gives this to us, like Mary and Elizabeth, like bump tummies. It's really cute, right? And there's the angels singing Silent Night, and there's the shepherds and the little drummer boy. That's not biblical, but it's fun. I just had this memory. My mom, growing up, she had a whole bunch of nativity scenes that she had collected, and she spent some time in Beirut in the Middle East in that area, and so she had these like beautifully carved olive wood nativities, and we'd set them up all over the house. We had like 7 or 8, but there was something weird. She wouldn't put baby Jesus out until Christmas Eve, and so she had a hidden drawer, a stash filled with baby Jesuses, just like 10 or 15 baby Jesuses. And I remember one year, my baby Yoda got caught up in it. And so there was like a Yoda in the manger scene as a baby Jesus, which was weird. Not exactly what was going on. It was weird. It was strange. I'm not trying to call it my mom. I just think it's weird that she had like some sort of hidden stash of a bunch of baby Jesuses. It's just curious. But my point in all this is that we can hear this story so often that we can actually lose track of it. And the verse that we just read, that you guys just read, it's disorienting. That's not very Christmassy. And in fact, it's pretty horrific. We're going to go through it real quickly again. And I want you this time, as we go through this, to put yourself in the place of Joseph, a young man, a teenager, late teenager, and Mary, who also was a teenager. Maybe my daughter is a freshman in high school. She's 14, roughly that age, a little bit older. Put yourself in their shoes. Think about what they would have experienced as we read the story again with fresh eyes. So just kind of imagine what it would have been like for them to go through this. Because it is not Hallmark. It is not Precious Moments. It's much darker. Matthew 2. And we talked about this last week. We kind of preface this. This is going to get dark. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." Imagine you're woken up in the middle of the night by a revelatory dream from God Most High telling you, run! Because they're trying to kill the boy. What? So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." And when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity, who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Now, archaeologists and historians tell us that Bethlehem was a small town, probably about 1,000, 2,000 people. So in accordance with birth rates in the ancient world, this is probably somewhere between 25 and 50 infant boys. That's horrendous. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. Just as you think about this story, as you try to inhabit it and imagine the story that Matthew was trying to tell us, the Hallmark Christmassy kind of fades away, doesn't it? This is a story of tragedy and terror. This is not fun. I was just going through this. Think about it. You're a teenage girl. All of a sudden, you're told you're going to be pregnant, although you're not even married. So that's a weird week. There's pregnancy drama, right? Like where, you wonder, who's going to believe me? Like, who's going to believe me? And so you wonder, is Joseph going to leave? And he would have if God hadn't showed up in a dream. So now all of a sudden, there's all the swirls. And then in the middle of this, you grow great with child and people start wondering, but you're not married yet, what's going on? And there's all those swirling accusations. People aren't stupid. And then Rome says, hey, we need to take a census. And you're like 9 months pregnant. And you're told you have to go to your husband's ancestral home, which you've been kicked off of because of Roman taxation. You're not a farmer. That's not your land anymore. Rome's taxed you off of it, which is perhaps why Joseph is not a farmer, but rather an itinerant carpenter, a trade you can practice anywhere. And they say, go back to your birth town. So you got to travel, and you have to do this because Rome, this giant military-industrial complex, which has militarized your homeland, wants to take a census so they can take more tax money from you. That's good times. And at 9 months, you get on a donkey and you travel. This is hard work. You're not wealthy. You're displaced. You're away. And then you're there. Mary's there. For some reason, they can't get back to her home. She gives birth away from her family, away from her entire extended family, her mom, her extended family, her aunts, uncles, sisters, whatever Mary would have had. The people there that you support, you're all alone. You're with your husband, sort of, his family, in their house. That's weird. And then you're told in a dream sometime later, when the baby's an infant, that you have to flee for your life. Here's a map of where they went. They went from there all the way. It's like 600 miles. It's like from here to San Diego. It would take a month, easily. And you're fleeing through the desert in the middle of the night from a murderous tyrant with almost unlimited resources who wants to kill your baby. And if he wants to kill your baby, he might want to kill you too. They flee to Egypt. They live as refugees. Herod orders the infanticide, and sometime later, news trickles in. Did you hear what happened in Bethlehem? What happened in Bethlehem? Oh, you didn't hear. Herod, he killed them. He killed them all. Imagine that news settling in on you as you fled from your hometown. Then there's news that Herod dies, so they return, but they're still not safe because the new king is just as bad as his dad. And they're warned in another revelatory dream. God comes and speaks to Joseph, don't go. So you go 80 miles further north after that, 300 miles. I misspoke, it wasn't 600 miles, it's 300 miles. Another 300 miles back, another 80 miles north to a no-name podunk town in the middle of nowhere called Nazareth. I was thinking about this. Karina and I were talking about this week. There's this moment in Luke when the angel goes up to Mary and says, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Highly favored. If that's highly favored, guys, this term, highly favored, is not used of but 3 humans in the entire Bible. Highly favored. In the middle of this, I think we are tempted. Think about think about Mary. Think about Joseph. Think about the reality of their lives, what it must have been like, what they must have thought. Does your life feel highly favored if you're Mary and Joseph at this point, after all that you've been through? Does that feel like God's hand of favor upon your life? Right? This is really difficult stuff. I think one of the reasons it's so hard to believe that God is good sometimes is because life is not good. And the question, the temptation that must have entered into Mary and Joseph, that enters into you and I when life is difficult, when suffering happens, that's not really even our fault. I mean, this is not the life that Mary expected or dreamed of when she was a girl reading, Jewish teen beat. This is not what she would have thought of. Think about the disappointment, the confusion, but think about the suffering also, the hardship. And so we're tempted to believe, I think, in this moment, it raises the question, like, where is God in this? Has he abandoned us? Has he left? Is he even good? Because these things are so big and so frightening, they can only be stopped by God, and if they're not stopped by God, that must mean that God either doesn't care, doesn't see, or, worse, isn't even good. Last night at dinner, we had a family dinner with my wife's family, and my mother-in-law leaned over during dinner. It was a very loud restaurant. There was hustle and bustle. There was a Christmas party in the back room, and very loud people. Amazing, bustling, and she leans over and says, "Can I talk to you?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "It's my friend who's getting up in age. And her husband has just been diagnosed with dementia. He's a very large, physical, strong man, always has been. And he's in the throes of dementia, doesn't even remember people. And he's turning violent and confused and scared. And that disease of dementia, which affects this frontal lobe, is turning him agitated all the time. And she's small. She can't deal with it. It's too much. She had to have him put in a facility. And my mother-in-law says, and she's so angry at God. She said there are times when she just walks around her house just cursing and raising her fist at God and swearing at him. How? She was raised religious. Has God abandoned her? And she says, my mother-in-law says, I'm not religious. Is there anything to say to her? This is the reality of life. And I know in a room this size, I know some of the stories that inhabit this room right here. It is not a time always of joy and gladness and peanut brittle and presents. In a room this size, and there's just the stories that I know in this room, there are times when it's very, very difficult, very dark. And we're tempted, like Mary and Joseph, to wonder, perhaps, has God abandoned us? And to this, I want to turn to the scriptures, because the author of Matthew gives us 3 little snippets. This portion of scripture, Matthew 13 to 26, catalogs 3 distinct terrible moments. 3 terrible things, but each time, each little section ends with a pointer backwards, a hyperlink, if you will, a reference back to a story in the Old Testament. Matthew is trying to get us to see something. He's trying to get us to see, in the midst of this terrible tragedy, in the midst of sadness, in the midst of this deep disappointment and this question, that something else is going on. Because, see, here's the problem, and this is me and this is you. I believe to my core an untruth, that if God is in my life, then things will go well for me. I believe to my core that if God is in my story, once he enters my story, I've got all these dreams and ideas about how things are going to go, and God will, of course, help me make those things come true. I believe that. I believe that. That I'll be free. It'll at least be easier, right? It'll at least be easier. And most of my dreams will come true. And they'll go easily. I believe this. Theologians call this the myth of religious fulfillment. And I just believe this. I believe it, and maybe you do too. And it is just a lie. Now, life does get better, but Mary is highly favored. Does her life go easy? Think about the spiritual giants in the Bible: Paul, Peter, Jesus. Do things go swimmingly for them all the days of their lives? Or how about the Messiah himself, Jesus, upon whose favor God rests, the very Son of God, my Son with whom I am well pleased? Does his life go easy and pain-free? Matthew is trying to get us to see something. And if we pay attention to these verses, we're going to see what Matthew is trying to do. So let's go through these 3 movements, see what Matthew links back to, and see what he's trying to get us to consider. The truths he's trying to get us to see in the middle of this terrible story. So let's start with the first movement, movement 1, the first story, verses 13 to 15. Let's start with the text, and then we'll go back to the hyperlink. When Herod realized he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. And then Matthew ends this section with a hyperlink, with these words: "And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son." Now, and again, forgive me because we have to do this, because Matthew's making us do this. I'm going to show you what that prophet is and what that verse is. It's from a prophet named Hosea. It's from Hosea chapter 11, this Old Testament prophet named Hosea. And Hosea is talking about God's people. And this is what God says through the prophet Hosea. This is God speaking. He says, when Israel was a child, he's talking about the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, the Hebrew people. I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim, another word for Israel, to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. This is God speaking as a father, calling Israel his son. And he says, out of Egypt I called my son. This is a reference to the Exodus story. If you remember, the people of Israel were enslaved brutally by Pharaoh. And they were taken into captivity. They were enslaved, and God heard their cries and rescued them and pulled them out. And God is speaking like a father, saying, I rescued them. I loved them. I called my son out of Egypt. Now, what's weird about this is this about the Messiah, this verse. It's not. It's not. Now, there are other verses, you're familiar with them, of prophecy that speak directly about the Messiah, right? He'll be born in Bethlehem. He'll be from the seed of King David. He'll be born to a virgin. These are all specific prophecies about Jesus, and yet Matthew does not reference those specific prophecies, though he could have. Instead, he references something else going on, a much larger story. He's referencing the story of God rescuing his people out of Egypt, out of slavery, out of a murderous tyrant. And what did that murderous tyrant do? Do you remember what he did to consolidate power? He killed a whole bunch of babies. Do you remember? Do you see? What he's trying to do, Matthew, is not make a specific reference back to Jesus particularly, but to the big story that God's writing. The story of Pharaoh versus Yahweh. The story of an oppressive tyrant who's trying to kill some folks, and how God's going to rescue his people. Does that apply here? A murderous tyrant trying to do something, thwart God's plan, and God's going to move in much bigger ways that you and I can't possibly understand. Do you see what Matthew's trying to do? He's trying to link this story of Israel to the story of Jesus. He's trying to make a hyperlink. This is a much bigger story. Matthew is linking and saying there's a much bigger story going on than you and I can see. And even though it looks on its face like mere tragedy, just like that story in Exodus with the killing of Pharaoh and the babies being thrown into the Nile, looks like tragedy, God is actually at work. This is a hyperlink. This is an image that I encountered this year. It's one of my favorite images. It's a graphical representation of all the hyperlinks, all the inter-biblical links. On the left here is the beginning of Genesis, and over there is Revelation. And that web are all the links in the Bible, intertestamental, interbiblical. This is worth our lives to study this stuff. This is incredible. This is a staggering work of staggering genius. And Matthew is trying to say, yes, this is about Jesus, but it's about the story that God's writing. There was a time when an evil tyrant threatened God's plan, but he could not thwart it. And God, even in the midst of heartbreak, was doing something big. That's the first lesson. Then movement 2, Matthew continues. And the second movement, this middle movement that's verses 16 to 18. I'm going to read it. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, and take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And then, that's the text, and then the hyperlink back. What is Matthew going to refer back to? And he refers back to this. He said, this is what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, for they are no more. Okay, so now this one, if the first one was kind of confusing because it doesn't really deal with Jesus, but a much bigger story, this one is even more confusing. Are you saying that prophet Jeremiah, foreknew that all these babies were going to be killed? What's going on here? What's going on in the context of this? And again, Matthew's writing to a very Jewish audience, and they would have understood this. So forgive me, but for just a second or two, I want to try to explain this. The prophet Jeremiah wrote hundreds of years, about 600 years before Jesus was even on the scene. And the prophet Jeremiah saw something that was one of the most tragic moments in all of Israel's history. It was the complete and utter destruction of the capital city, Jerusalem, that was conquered by the Babylonians. This is in 586 BC. He was there in the city as it was sieged. It was under siege for a long time. Finally, Babylon broke through under King Nebuchadnezzar. He had more resources. They starved the city. They broke through the walls. They destroyed the temple. They burnt the city. They killed a whole bunch of people. And they led a whole bunch of people into exile, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. This was the fall of Jerusalem. This is the destruction of the temple. This is one of the great low moments in Israel's history. And in the middle of this, Jeremiah is writing, and he sees all this. He was a witness to all this. And as he's writing about this destruction, he talks about Rachel. And he imagines, and he puts kind of into words this. Rachel was a matriarch. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob were the three patriarchs, and their wives were Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel. She's like a superhero, like Wonder Woman. I mean, she's like this huge figure in the imagination of the Israel people. She was there in the founding, right? So she's an important, founding mother. Important character. And Jeremiah imagines her crying, weeping for the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Israel's people, of all the loss of life. She imagines her weeping for this story of destruction and death, as though she were looking into history from beyond the grave and crying for this terrible circumstance. It would be like, imagine somebody after 9/11 saying that Martha Washington and George Washington were weeping over the destruction of the towers. Something like that. Something similar. And Jeremiah puts this into the context. But there's something kind of interesting about Rachel. Rachel, if you're familiar with her story, she herself was well acquainted with suffering. There's a story where she's giving birth to her second child, and it's not going well. And she knows she's going to die. And she dies giving birth to Benjamin, who is the 12th child of this lineage that would become the 12 tribes. And in her last word, she cries out, "Name him son of my suffering." And her husband just can't take that. It's too dark. It's too sad. He's lost his beloved. If you're familiar with the story, Rachel was his prized wife, his beautiful wife that he loved. And he can't take it, so he names him Ben-Yamin instead. And in the middle of this story, she's buried in this place called Ramah, which is just outside of Bethlehem. Just outside. So there's a matriarch buried just outside of Bethlehem who later on would say, "I weep," in the prophet Jeremiah, "I weep for the destruction of the infants and the loss of life." Do you see what Matthew is doing? He's trying to make a link to this story of sin and suffering and death, the siege of Jerusalem, and he's trying to make the point, look, sin and tragedy happen. And Rachel weeps. She wept for her own loss of life as she died in childbirth. She weeps over Israel and the fall of Israel to Babylon. She weeps for the loss of life, for the destruction of the temple, for all the tragedy. She weeps. Sin and tragedy happen, but the very next verse, after that verse, listen to what God says. Restrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your work will be rewarded, declares the Lord. They will return from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your descendants, declares the Lord. Even in the midst of incredible tragedy, the lowest moment in Israel's history, God counterbalances that utter hopelessness and depression and destruction with a word of hope and encouragement that somehow, some way, God is going to work to even bring healing to this, the worst of all situations, the destruction of Jerusalem. Somehow God is going to restore and do some sort of work that is going to reverse this. How? We have no idea. It seems impossible. But what Matthew is trying to say is just as God can reverse and beat sin and tragedy, he's trying to say sadness and tragedy do not win the day. God actually is at work, even in the lowest moments, even in moments where mothers weep for their children. Even in the worst moments, somehow God is at work in a grand story. Jeremiah prophesied it, and Matthew is claiming it, that somehow, even though a mother weeps for her children, her son, the good will come out of it. Later on, outside of Jerusalem, another mother would weep for her son too, as he was nailed to a cross. And yet, in the middle of that, God was doing something unimaginably good. Because sin and tragedy and sadness and tragedy do not win. They don't. And then the third movement, the third parcel that Matthew includes. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. For those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in that place, in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now, if the first reference that Matthew makes isn't really about Jesus, but about the bigger story of God, if the second verse is even more confusing about the destruction of the siege of Jerusalem, and how in the world does that tie to Jesus, this third one makes zero sense. Go ahead and do a biblical search for all the prophecies through all the prophets about Nazareth, and you'll find nothing. It's like, Matthew, if you're going to make an Old Testament reference, you should probably include something in the Old Testament. And he says, this is what was fulfilled, what was said through the prophets. He's even vague. He doesn't say Jeremiah, he doesn't say Hosea, he just says the prophets. And so it's like, what are you doing, Matthew? And what Matthew is doing is really particular. He's doing something very particular, but it's subtle. And you got to be Jewish kind of to get it, because Matthew's super Jewish. He super knows these scriptures. He knows them like you and I know the lyrics to the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air theme song. I mean, he's just known backwards and forwards. So let's talk about Nazareth for a second. Do you remember that moment in the Gospel of John when Nathanael and Jesus is out there, and one of the disciples comes up to Nathanael and says, "Hey, I just met the Messiah. He's from Nazareth." And Nathanael says very comically, "Nazareth? Can anything good come from there?" Nazareth in the ancient Greek is translated into Fresno. It's very subtle. Very subtle. It's not. Please don't email me if you're from Fresno. I'm glad you're here. It's a no-name town. Actually, Fresno's way too big. It would be like Los Baños, like Nowheresville, in the middle of Sticksville. It's not important. It's not a center of commerce. There's no port. It's nowhere. Now, here's what's interesting. Here's what, through the ages, people are like, what is Matthew talking about? Why would he say this Nazareth thing? Because it's not in the Old Testament. And then you realize, oh, what's going on here? There's this verse in Isaiah. And in the prophet Isaiah says this. He says, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Do you remember this verse? This is basically talking about where the Messiah is going to come from. And it's from the line of Jesse, King David. King David's line. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. Now, Jesse was the father of King David. And so it says a shoot or a tiny tree, a baby Groot, will shoot up from the stump of Jesse. And from his roots, a branch will bear fruit. And this word for stump is Nazareth. And the town of Nazareth is named after, it has phonetic identical to this. So basically, Nazareth is Stump Town. And where's the Messiah going to come from? Stump Town. The idea is that the Messiah is not going to be from a flashy place, born in a palace in the biggest city. Shockingly, the Messiah is going to be born to nobodies in the middle of nowhere. Isaiah later on would say this, and I'm going to read this whole verse. I think this is so staggeringly beautiful. Isaiah would say this about the future Messiah. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He's talking about the Messiah. He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of the dry ground. This is the stump, the Nazareth words. The Messiah had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. You would recall later on the humiliation of the crucifixion. But then Isaiah continues on. And yet, surely he took our pain and bore our suffering. We considered him, we thought that he was punished by God, stricken by God, afflicted by God. But that wasn't true. It wasn't true that he was forgotten by God or punished or afflicted by God. What was true is he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we're saved, we're healed. Isaiah is saying the Messiah, he's going to be a man of suffering, a man from nowhere, who's going to live a life that no one would have chosen voluntarily, of rejection. Remember what John says. The people who saw the light, they rejected it. What Matthew is saying is that the Messiah is going to come to Nowheresville, to people who were nobody, lowly and meek. And yet, just because he doesn't come in a palace doesn't mean that God has not come to earth. In fact, the opposite is true. If God can come to this, the lowest of all places, if God can come to this, peasant teenagers in the middle of nowhere, born in a cave, laid in a manger, then perhaps there is nowhere that God can break through with his presence. There's perhaps nowhere, no situation too unknown, no situation too difficult that God cannot break into. No darkness that the light cannot illuminate. So Matthew's 3 lessons. Perhaps one of them is needed for you, and I think about my mother-in-law's friend. Maybe you're in a similar situation. Maybe not as extreme, but maybe just as extreme to you. Perhaps you'll need to be reminded of the lessons from this part of the Gospel of Matthew, that God hears his people's cries and moves to rescue them. That the world is broken, but God is at work to put it back together. And that God is with his people. The Messiah has come to the lowly and humble. He himself is lowly and humble. Which of these do you most need to remember now? Because if we can remember them, if we can find it in ourselves to listen to what Matthew is saying, then there's truly hope this Christmas. Because God hears and he rescues. The world is broken, but God is working to put it back together. And that God is with his people. He doesn't remove us from suffering, but he walks with us through the suffering. And the Messiah will someday beat sin and death. There's a Christmas song, and Karina and I were talking about this, and there's a Christmas song. It's kind of a famous one, and it was written during the time of the Civil War by a poet named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a famous poet. In 1861, his wife died at an at-home accident, and Longfellow fell into a deep depression. In 1862, in his journal, he writes, "Merry Christmas, say the children, but it is no more from me." 3 months later, in March of 1863, Longfellow's son Charlie enlisted in the military at the height of the American Civil War, against his father's wishes, who did not want to see his beloved son killed in the battle. Longfellow was a staunch abolitionist, but he was conflicted about sending his own boy off to die. On December 8th, 1863, Charlie was shot during the battle. The bullet just missed his spine. It spared his life. But Longfellow brought him home to Cambridge. And 2 weeks later, on Christmas Day, 1863, at the height of the American Civil War, a nation torn apart, his life torn apart, himself in deep, deep mourning, Longfellow wrote this poem. It's called, "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day." And the final verse says, "And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth," I said, "for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men." Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill toward men. This is the hope of Mary and Joseph's story. This is the hope that Matthew is pointing us to. This is the hope of Christmas. And as Karina sings this song, put to the words of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's famous poem, let us sit and reflect on this truth this Christmas.